Hi, everyone, and welcome to this broadcast. Mark DeJesus here, bringing you insights to help equip you in your healing and freedom journey, especially when it comes to mental, emotional, and relationship health. Today, I want to get into the subject of sobriety and what shame attacks do, and I want to get into two enemies. These are often two ditches we can get into when shame hits us and even shame attacks hit us. I've been doing a lot of work and a number of broadcasts on the subject of shame. I did one on the root of abandonment and shame attacks. I did one on 10 signs of a shame attack. I have a number of episodes on just the subject of shame, what it does to our lives and our journey. Then my wife and I also did an episode on our journey working through shame, abandonment, and perfectionism. So before I get into those two ditches, I want to mention what sobriety actually is, because sobriety is the place that we want to go into, and I'm going to show you two areas that we tend to go into that actually keep us out of sobriety. Now, I also did an episode on the biblical perspectives of the word sober. You can check that out as well too. So I'm not going to get into a long definition. I'm just going to give you a very, very simple and practical one. And that is of sobriety first. And that is sobriety is we see ourselves and our lives the way we need to. And so that we are able to effectively walk our journey, we're able to heal through what we need to heal through, we're able to mature in what we need to, grow in what we need to grow, become empowered in what we need to be empowered for. Kind of simple, right? So I see it. I see myself the way I need to see myself. There's a grounded, balanced, yet awake perspective. And I also see my life the way that I need to. And so many of us are taken out of our sobriety in many ways. Now, in walking through this, first, it involves walking in the light. We face ourselves in the light of God. And God says that as we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, right? But so many of us are hiding, we struggle, we don't feel safe. Our brokenness, our fears take over, our trauma, the drama of our lives prevents us from being able to walk in the light. And even just this statement alone, face ourselves in the light of God, sends many people into terror because of their vision and their filter of how they see God and how they relate to Him. That's why the second part is so important. It is in the light of love and grace, because God's light is not a condemning, shameful exposure. It is a loving invitation for authentic connection with Him, so that in His love, in His grace, our lives are changed through connection with Him, the truth that sets us free. So if you struggle with number one, number two needs to be really visited and worked through. In fact, we're always in a journey of learning what this means, because it points us to compassion, the compassionate view of God over our journey. So the end result of sobriety is we actually become empowered, because we're more awake, we're more effective, and we see our lives in the way that we need to see them. So with this said, I want to get into the two ditches, and I'm going to explain it in a bunch of different ways and help you to be able to see where you sometimes fall into that prevents you from the clarity that you need. Okay, so as I share these things, please understand, this is all meant to be processed in compassionate grace. Our goal here is sobriety. But what a shame attack will do is bounce us into these ditches we get into that don't allow our healing journey to be productive. So understand, as you're processing through, there's a tendency for people to fall into, even as I'm teaching this, to fall into some of these areas. Compassionate grace brings us back to sobriety, okay? So right down the middle here, we have some characteristics that sobriety can produce. And I'll get into some more here, but these are the starters. What happens, instead of living sober, we can fall into one of two ditches. One is the ditch of denial. The sense of like, no, I'm not going there. It doesn't exist. There can be a trickle down of so many aspects of that: stubbornness, pride, defensiveness, kickback, even passivity, dismissing, right? Because shame hits, and that's the protective mechanism. Many times we can get right into denial because we're kicking back. In the garden, that's Adam's response. He starts blaming God, blaming Eve, and there's a shame response reaction there. Then there's the other ditch that we can go into, which is drowning, which means we become overwhelmed and consumed by a realization or a thought of something. It takes us out. So now we can't see things the way that we need to see them because we're drowning. And if you know anything about rescuing someone who's drowning, you have to first bring them to a calm, collective place. Otherwise, they can drown themselves and the lifeguard. So we want to be aware of this because no one can do this for you. No one can pull out this chart and go, hey, you're in this or you're in this. The stuff I'm teaching here is stuff that we need to be sober about. We need to come to an awareness because I have found myself at different stages in my life being in all of these areas. So if you feel all of them, don't worry about it. We're all in a journey of healing through this to recapture our sobriety. But the first area here is when the shame attack hits, instead of being calm and collective about what I see, because that's sobriety. Okay, here's the problems. Here's what's going on. Here's what happened. Here's what I've done. Here's what I grew up with. Okay, I see it for what it is. Instead, we can fall into this ditch and get very defensive about it. Shame attack hits, we're defensive. We can get argumentative. We kick back with that. Or we drown in despair. The way I describe despair, it's like a trap door opening out from underneath us. We're just falling and falling and falling. It's like falling off a cliff emotionally and not knowing how to land. Both of these keep us from seeing calm and collectively what we need to see. In sobriety, we face our fears. We don't get into avoidance, we face, and we realize in sobriety we are soldiers, loved by God, sons and daughters, with an ability to live out of victory, but we got to face our fears one layer at a time in our life and our journey. But the problem is, we get out of sobriety, we get into avoidance. One avoidance is don't go there. The person in denial, it's like they have a bunch of don't go there subjects. Can't talk about it. You can't touch on that because you're going to get anger, you're going to get rage, you're going to get argumentativeness, you're going to get shut down, you're going to get a lot of difficulties because they can't hear or take in things because they're afraid, because shame and fear are doing a number on their thinking. Then on the other side, in the drowning, they are actually avoiding in their spinning. Now you say, wow, how are they avoiding? Well, if I realize something is going on in my life, if I realize that something I've said has truly harmed someone, or if I am aware of a diagnosis in my life, if I spin about it, it doesn't allow me to see it for what I need to see. I start going into despair. I catastrophize. I start ruminate. I'm emotionally spinning and I'm not sober. In my sobriety, I face the fear so that I no longer let the monster of fear have a weapon against me. Most of our battles of our brokenness and our thoughts have to do with our fear. We're afraid of them. We're afraid of the exposure. We're afraid of what it looks like to face ourselves. Now, sobriety is built on compassionate grace. Now, when you have a shame attack, though, you feel disconnected from compassion. You feel disconnected from grace. That's why it's important when a shame attack hits, we start becoming aware. Where am I going in this? Okay, hold on, ride through these feelings of shame because I need to get back to calm and collective so I can be sober. But instead of compassionate grace, many times those in denial, they're under legalism because they're like, I don't want to go there because they have a law-based black and white kind of mentality, so they get very, very defensive about it. People in the other ditch can have legalism too because they constantly self-condemn. So instead of being sober and compassionate grace and being kind to themselves, they self-condemn. It gets into worthlessness, even self-hatred. They shame on themselves. Now, I've learned that in sobriety, there's a gracious beauty of vulnerability, fruitful and helpful vulnerability. When a shame attack hits the person in denial, they go to performance-driven Christianity. That's their protective mechanism. They have a presentation, they can be achievers, or they're just very, here's how I go about serving God. And there's a form of perfectionism that keeps that performance fueled by a lot of anger, a lot of sense of disconnection. Now, What we want is we want productive, helpful vulnerability. But those that are drowning, they can often do unproductive sharing. And what do I mean by that? It means that we're constantly sharing how bad it is, how bad our struggle is, how we're constantly sharing with people, I had a bad day today, I had a bad day today, I'm struggling. So what happens is we create these ingrained patterns of relating to people. So now we relate through our struggle. And it's like we don't know how to relate outside of our struggle. So, for example, people ask you, how are you doing today? It always has to be the problem that you're struggling through, so it keeps feeding it. And there is productive, vulnerable sharing where we share and we learn to love one another and we learn to realize we're not alone. A lot of the people that unproductively share, they haven't had a healthy model of how to be vulnerable, do it effectively. And people over here in their shell, they don't know how to begin to even, they're afraid. They're afraid of vulnerability. Shame has hit them, so don't even go there. This whole subject frightens them. So they rather stay in this mode, which then leads them to focusing on their appearance. This, in the perfectionist performance, they're focused on how things look. The shame attack hits this arena hard, not because something has been revealed, but because a sense of other people see it. There's a great deal of embarrassment that happens because the image has been tainted, or the presentation is now cracking. And this is an opportunity for us to go, okay, I'm putting so much into how I appear, I'm not giving room for vulnerability and an authentic journey. This is what sobriety leads us into. It's an authentic journey where there's compassionate grace. I'm on a journey. I've got brokenness. I've got things I'm working through, and so do you. Let's take the journey together. Instead, the denial is focused on appearance. As long as the marriage looks good to the public, as long as the family looks good to the public, as long as I look a certain way to the people, then that's what I'm going to invest in. But there's no room for journey. I'm in process and I'm growing and I'm healing. Well, on the other side, in the drowning, they're constantly disqualifying themselves because they're just never good enough, never can do enough. So it disempowers them from the journey that's available. To say, hey, step up, you can get off that rock, and you don't have to stay there and sit there. Get up, and want you to take one step forward. I can, because, right? Because they're stuck in these kind of patterns. And that leads into some areas, and if you want to go further on this, these are massive breakthroughs in my life. And they have to do with the subject of self-pity, victim thinking, and even foreboding. And I did a series on that, an in-depth series on those. That revolutionized my mental and emotional health in ways that were literally 180s, simply because I realized how many of these areas led me into a self-pity pattern that actually was unloving. I was actually taking the pain of my life and abusing myself with self-pity, self-loathing, victim thinking. Where over here, they just don't feel safe to come out, so they keep all their guards up and all their defensive mechanisms at play. Okay, what are you seeing in your own life, in your own journey? All right, so I'm going to give you some more. I told you I'm going to give you a bunch because I want to compare and contrast to help us walk in the greater sobriety that's available for us. And you're going to see there's a lot of areas this can get into. When it comes to being sobered, we're heart empowered, meaning I'm connected to the power that's available to just take the next step in my journey. That's it. It's not having all the answers, having everything figured out. Well, those in denial, they're disconnected in how they see things. They're disconnected from being heart empowered because they're afraid to go there because they feel they're going to be shamed and ridiculed, so they often just don't bother. Whereas those that are drowning, they constantly feel helpless. There's even a psychological term called learned helplessness, where over life we become conditioned that there are no answers, there's nothing available, we cannot. So we think we're seeing the problem, but we're actually not. We're seeing a helpless perspective of the problem that leaves us disempowered. Okay? Now, this is an important one for sobriety, and that is listening. When we get out of sobriety, we're actually not listening to helpful information that is being said. We're not listening to cues in life or helpful clues that can help us to learn and grow in our journey. The one in defensiveness, they get their panic response, because remember, this is all shame attack responses. They're defensive. It's just, you just can't go there. Their panic response is defensive, so they're not actually listening because they're in a survival mode. Then the other side is they think they're listening, but they're catastrophizing. They're taking what's being said and they're turning it into, I'll never be healed, I'll never be well, things will never work out, this is all going to end terribly, my whole family won't love me, and all. And we're spiraling, so we're not actually actively listening. In a lot of my work with obsessive compulsive battlegrounds, I constantly have to tell my brothers and sisters it's important that we listen to instruction, because they will often catastrophize. Sometimes they can actually be defensive about their OCD issues, right? Defensive about their ways, and they can actually be controlling about it and angry about it and need you to cooperate with them. They're very defensive, but then they can actually spin back to catastrophizing. But many in their mental health battlegrounds struggle with not hearing, but catastrophizing. It takes them out of sobriety. And remember too, we can we can usually start over here. If we start over here and then swing over there, once we've exhausted this side. In sobriety, we recognize I am loved. I am loved. I'm loved by God. His love doesn't change because of what's happening here. The denier says, I will be abandoned. So they don't want to fully enter into that unconditional love, because they're like, no, at some point I will be abandoned. Whereas the one who drowns, they believe, I've already been abandoned. I'm already abandoned. Now, this is when people say, well, how do I get into a healthier place? It really starts with humility. It starts with humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. He'll lift us up. Right? Because both these categories actually take us out of humility. The person who's drowning, they actually think they're humble, but they're not. There's actually a form of pride. It's a stubborn self-rejection. You see, when God says, I love you, and we say, no, you don't, and when we live our lives out of that, it's actually a form of pride. We don't realize that. Then there's the form of pride where it's self-righteous. We've built up a structure of what we present to people as our way of relating. Humility recognizes our need for God, recognizes we don't have to create this presentation that's so impressive. We can be ourselves because we're in a journey. Why? Because we're relating to a loving Father. Now, those in the denial area, they avoid intimacy. They avoid that deep connection because they don't want to go there. Don't go there, because intimacy with a loving Father or even loving relationships brings out that fear, so they withdraw a lot. Whereas on the other end, those who drown, they relate to others through neediness. So they may find you. Now, let's not talk about you. Let's talk about other people. Another person may find you and you're so loving, right? And they love that, and then they latch onto you, and now this excessive neediness, because they need you to be something, they're pulling at you. This is fueled by a rejection mindset. Rejection trains us that we need someone else to be something for us. It's a form of codependency. And so it doesn't let us land in, I'm loved by my Father. Because the drowning one says, I'm already abandoned. They're in a panic state. So they relate out of neediness. They relate, actually, their identity becomes their battle and their struggle. In sobriety, we recognize sonship. I'm a son or a daughter. That is my identity. But the one who's drowning, their ID, their identification, their identity is their struggle or their suffering. It becomes the currency in how they relate to other people. That's why many times in my personal work with people, I've had to ask them, do you really want to be healed and let go of the constant story that you bring out? Now, I talk about story, I talk about being stuck, I talk about all that in other episodes and other broadcasts. Now, on the other end, the one who's in denial, their ID or their identity is their presentation. It may be they're a performer on stage. Maybe they're a performer in life. Maybe they're an achiever. They wear a mask, and a mask is the presentation. So they put all the work into the mask that they present to others. That's how they relate. So these both keep us out of sonship and keep us in slavery. And many people are living in perpetual spiritual slavery. They haven't been able to sober up in their sonship, because when you realize you're a son or daughter, you wake up to the potential you have in the family because you belong, you are the fathers, you are connected, right? That's why I talk so much about getting rooted in who God is as a loving father and in our sonship. Now, where the rubber meets the road, this is where things get a little bit tricky in the journey. This is where the leaves start getting rustled, is in the area of correction, because our lives are changed by helpful correction. Now, many of us have not been corrected in healthy ways. We've been shamed, blamed, accused, even abused in the name of correction, right? So I understand. But it's time for us to sober up, because there is correction all of us can gain to help in our journey from those who love us, know us, or truth that is brought to us that can set us free. The problem is that shame attacks squash correction, because shame doesn't want you to grow and improve. It wants to keep you stuck by keeping you in shame attacks and shame protective mechanisms in either direction. So what it does to the denier is it gets you in self-consumed defensiveness. So for example, a wife comes to her husband and says, honey, I got to pour my heart out to you. There's some patterns in the way you've been angry. I don't feel safe talking to you. And he immediately goes into a denial defensive posture. Well, you don't understand what I've been going through. And now the discussion gets turned. It's no longer about what she said. It's about him. We can all do this. Every single one of us has done this. We get into a moment. It now becomes consumed with self and protect, because I'm not loved, right? Now, yes, people need to know how to bring correction in a healthy way, right? But in this category, they can't bring it to you, no matter what, because this rises up and you can't receive what is needed in your journey. On the other side, in the other ditch, it becomes a self-rejecting spiral. So now it becomes something where you're spiraling. I'm so bad. I'm so terrible. And it's no. I'm just bringing out something that can help you in your journey. No, I'm just so awful. Here's where we go. I'm a terrible mother. I'm a terrible husband. I'm a terrible parent. I'm a terrible Christian. We're spiraling out, right? And we're not receiving the sobriety of no. You're loved. See what you need to see so that you can actually move forward. And it's interesting because in the scriptures, it talks about if we can receive healthy correction, it actually reveals the sonship within us, right? Because a son can be corrected. He realizes this doesn't change the love of the Father. This doesn't change my identity and my security in this dynamic and relationship. So I can hear this and actually grow. So where do you find yourself on this? And where do you feel that, you know what, these are some areas that I can be more aware of and start to make some course corrections, invite humility, and let sobriety have a deeper work? All right, so I told you there'd be a bunch here. You're getting a masterclass deep dive into some of the patterns that we fall into. And I'm comparing and contrasting them to help your discernment. This is the last page I'm going to give, and some of it gets out of the camera, so I'll have to lift it up there so you can see it. So we've got this issue of denial and drowning. Which do you find yourself in? I found myself in both. Many times here first, and then in the drowning. But I can go right to drowning right away. The word sober speaks of being alert and watchful. There's a watching that's going on. Those in denial, they often become very passive. They become avoidant. They can be passive in their marriage, passive in their parenting, passive in being emotionally connected. Because this alert and watchful is, I'm emotionally aware of what's going on in my life and in those around me that are important to my life and that I'm looking out for. They can be passive. They can also be very dismissive. Oh, stop worrying. Don't worry. And they're not willing to be alert and deal with the issue at hand. Whereas the one who drowns, they're hyper vigilant. Not vigilant, where the Bible says be sober, be vigilant. They're hyper vigilant, which is they're constantly checking, and they're checking for danger in a constant way. A lot of times this comes out of trauma. Unhealed trauma in our lives, that just either complex trauma PTSD, just unhealed trauma that's happened in our life that's here. Now, trauma can also lead people here too. Like, I don't want to deal. The Bible talks about sobriety being of sound mind. There's a lot of terms like sound mind or self-control where we're able to take our emotions and navigate them and nurture them and balance and ground them out. That takes practice. It doesn't just something that just turns on like a light switch. Well, those who are in denial, they're disconnected to emotions. So they're not aware of what's going on. They're not aware of what's really happening in the life of their heart. Whereas those in the other ditch of drowning, they're over emotional. And so emotions take over, and they find themselves maybe up and down or all over the place. Now, the word sober, as we commonly look at it, means not being drunk or being intoxicated. The one in denial is actually drunk on public perception. Now, I know that not being drunk is not having something that leads you to an altered state of consciousness, some type of substance abuse pattern. I want to go deeper, though. Go to emotional aspects. The one over here, they're drunk on public perception. Their main effort and energy is how things look, and that's where they invest in. And when that gets cracked, they panic. Whereas on the other side, the one who's drowning, they're drunk on their suffering. Now, they might be going through legitimate suffering or struggle, but from the Bible's perspective, the apostles were able to go through suffering and manifest the fruit of the Spirit and joy. Many of us struggle with that because we've not been mentored and fathered in how to walk in overcoming life. So we become intoxicated by our struggle. It consumes our perspective. In sobriety, we learn to remain awake, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, alert and awake. Whereas the one in denial, there's little to no reaction going on. It's just not much because they're avoiders, they're passive, they don't deal with things. Whereas in the drowning side, we overreact. So now it's like, oh no, I'm a narcissist, right? That's a common one. No, you're not. Yes, I'm a narcissist. Now we're spinning out. I have this terrible mental health problem and it's going to be for the rest of my life and it's going to ruin my family and my children. We're not being awake. See? And this is where we have to sober up, get back here to see you're loved. God's grace is here. But in the light, let's see it for what it is, right? Because fear and shame just keep driving us to these ditches. Now, a big aspect of being sober is that we're open to new learning. And this is very, very important because when we're open to new learning, we are able to embrace what's next in our life and our journey. We're able to embrace what's available. When I'm sober, I can hear things, I can see things for what it is, and I can take the next step because I'm learning. I'm on a journey. There's no condemnation. I'm learning to heal and grow, and everybody's got battles and struggles, right? Now, the one in denial, they have a response, no, I do everything right. They may not say it exactly that way, but that's their defensive posture that they give off. Whereas the other one is, I do everything wrong. I can't catch a break. I can't get anywhere. That gets rooted in more self-loathing and self-pity. The learning is helping us to deal with this failure issue here. I don't know if you can see that in the camera. I think you can. This failure issue because the denier has a fear. They fear failure, so that's what keeps their defensive posture going because any failure says they are a failure. That's what shame says. Shame says you are a failure. It doesn't let you see, okay, there's some learning here. So the one who drowns, they drown in failure. I am an absolute failure. On this side, they're avoiding anything because they don't want to be seen as a failure. And this side, they've just wrapped their arms around failure and said, I am a failure. So, another part of our healing journey that can be very, very helpful, you have to excuse me here because I want to hold this up so you guys can see this, has to do with the issue of flaws. In sobriety, we learn to embrace our flaws because our flaws do not mean the end of relationship. It doesn't mean God's left us and abandoned us. We're on a journey, we're learning, we're healing and growing. Whereas the denier hides their flaws, okay? And the one who's drowning hides from their flaws, right? So we can fall into a little bit of both, right? This is hide protective mechanisms, and they can't look at their flaws because they drown every time. So they're running away from them because every time they get triggered into those areas. So this all starts with humbling ourselves and connecting to the love that God has for us. We are safe in Him. And part of the healing journey is going to be learning who He is as a loving Father. I recommend you get my resource, Experiencing God's Love as Your Father. We have to establish a sense of who is God, how do I relate to Him, and relearning areas of our life that are based on punishment-based relationships, shame, and rejection. A second resource is Exposing the Rejection Mindset. This is going to help you deal with the root issue that takes place in our lives when we're not rooted and taught in the love our Father has for us, and our identity gets compromised. So those two resources are a great place to start. You can also check out all my shame resources and let me know what helped you in this. You can email me, mark@markdejesus.com. But if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and also go to markdejesus.com and subscribe to our regular newsletter, email that will come to you to just update you on new things that are happening. You can also get a free copy of the ebook version of Experiencing God's Love as Your Father. If you want to support these resources, click on the donate button and you can support these ministry materials. I pray it's a blessing to your life and your journey. I'll see you in a future broadcast. God bless you.